Hello, my friends. On today's episode, I'm talking with Ben Pickard, and we are talking about our three most commonly asked HR questions and giving you our answers. And listen, I know HR is not the sexiest topic for all of you, but it's one of those parts of your business that if you don't get it right, you can get in some real trouble legally. So I think it's an important episode for all of you, especially those of you who maybe don't love the HR function of owning a business. Keep on listening and take some notes. Let's dive in. Hello, fitness business nerds. What's up? Welcome to another episode of the Business for Unicorns podcast. Before we jump into today's episode, I got a question for you, listeners. Do you want to spend the weekend learning with like-minded gym owners and the Business for Unicorns team, including me and Mark and Ben and Pete? Well, you can. Between now and Monday, December 16th, we're offering our super early bird pricing of $199 per ticket for our 2025 Unicorn Society retreats. So you can join us in Toronto in March for our marketing and sales focus, or in Denver in September for our people and systems focus. For more details about those retreats, send us a DM on Instagram. Link is below in our show notes. We'd love to see you there. I also want to point out that I pronounced Toronto correctly and didn't pronounce the T, so Ben won't be mad at me. Which brings me to today's episode. Welcome to the podcast, Mr. Pickard. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Did I make Canadians happy by not saying Toronto?
I hope so. Yeah, it's nobody in Canada, dear listeners, says Toronto.
I know
it's Toronto.
It's Toronto. I know it's so strange, but I'm doing it. I'm honoring your culture. Well, let's dive into today's topic, which is maybe not the sexiest topic ever because we're talking about HR stuff, but I think it's a really important one, is because so many of our listeners and gym owners out there didn't get into the gym business because you want to be the director of HR for your business, right? And so often as business coaches, we get asked a lot of these HR kind of questions because no one ever teaches us this stuff. And sometimes it's hard to find good information out there. So what we wanted to do today is go over just three, there are many more, but three of our most common HR questions. So Ben and I can give you all some straight answers. How's that sound, Ben?
Sounds perfect. Yeah, and just plus one what you said of we got into this because we like helping people or fitness, or we didn't like our boss, thought we could do it better or whatever. And if nothing else, you want to keep yourself out of legal trouble. So making sure you nail this stuff is absolutely critical to the long-term success of your gym.
Yeah, 100%. And I'll start off with a little disclaimer, and I'm sure I'll put this in the show notes as well, that we're not lawyers, we're not legal professionals. Hell, we're not even like certified HR professionals. So this is not legal advice. We're not giving you legal advice, but we've been doing this for a while. And what we're going to do is share our experience of what we've done and what we've seen hundreds of other gym owners do when it comes to answering these three most common questions. So the first question we get is usually about right up front. When it comes to hiring a new employee, we often get the question about, what do I need to get them to sign when they first join? Meaning, do I need to have them sign a contract, a compensation agreement? If someone's a contractor versus part-time versus full-time, what do I need them to sign as a condition of their employment when they first join? And so I have thoughts on this, but Ben, do you want to take it away? What has your experience been in terms of what you think people need to get their employees to sign when they first join the team?
Yeah, they absolutely need to sign stuff.
Yep.
I'm pretty confident I'm wrong about that, despite my lack of a law degree. So I think the first piece to say is like you should check with what you need to get people to sign as an employee in your country, your state, or your jurisdiction, because everything's going to be a little bit different. But I think people should generally, in broad strokes, sign some sort of employment agreement that outlines what are you actually hiring them for? What does compensation look like? Because that's a topic of friction if you don't get that out of the way. Like, what are the expectations of the job? You don't have to have it perfectly nailed. You can, like ours actually say, like, responsibilities will change over time, but like, here's the general list. It's not the minutes that they're spending each thing, but it's like you're doing coaching and programming and some cleaning and attending meetings, like the broad stuff. We also need to have people sign like tax forms and things so that they can get paid if you do direct deposit. And there's things to, at least in Canada, you have to set up with the government that shows that Michael Keeler is an employee of Lean Strong Fitness. And that's like a thing that is happening now for tax purposes. I will say, like, this is something that, at least in my experience, is worth hiring a HR professional for. You could go to a lawyer for this. At my gym, we actually went to an HR company, and there were some things that they told us that, like, example, in Canada, Canadian listeners, here's a tidbit for you. You have to include the Employment Standards Act's poster as the final page or a page, I'm not sure, in their employment agreement. I didn't know that. So for the first little bit, when I had employees, I didn't give them that thing.
Yep.
That's the thing I'm legally required to give them. So paying $1,000 or so to an HR professional to have a templated agreement that I can just like plop people's names into was absolutely worth the money.
Yeah, 100%. I think that you're on the right track. I think the two buckets I would put this in is there are things you get them to sign to clarify what their job is and what their compensation is, just clarity of your relationship and what their role is. And there are things you get them to sign for your government. And the U.S., we typically have federal, state, and local requirements in some cases, especially if you're in a big city like New York. There are 3 levels of federal requirements. And so, in the U.S., I'll just speak to our U.S. folks for a second because I know those well. Those are things like your I-9, which is basically an employee eligibility form. A W-4 basically is for people who are going to withhold income tax through the employee, like full-time employee and part-time employees. There's state-specific stuff about what taxes you're withholding from them. And so I think those are the 2 buckets of things. And as Ben said, we're not going to be able to speak to all of your needs out there, but most, I can speak to the US, and I think most countries, they have online free resources for these things. Right? Hopefully we're paying our taxes so our government can teach us how to obey the law in some ways. So go Google these things, but don't go to the miscellaneous website. Go to your actual national, federal, state, local websites and see what resources and tools they have for small businesses. They will tell you, often they'll give you a checklist for things they want you to do with brand new employees. And you'll find fun things like Ben found out, which is like, crap, I need to have this poster be part of my onboarding packet. I had no idea. And so I think go do your due diligence. But I think when it comes to contracts, the part I want to zoom in on, the first bucket of clarifying their role and responsibility. I will say there's 2 thoughts about this. I think Pete's been on this podcast before and actually talks about having term limit contracts with his employees. And he really likes the idea that everyone's committing to, I think it's 2 years. When you're on the podcast next, Pete, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think his employees are committed to about 2 years. And then they have to kind of renegotiate and talk about whether or not they're going to stay. And he likes that cycle of having kind of term limit actual contracts. For most of you, most of the time, you're probably not going to need anything like that with term limits or a fancy long contract. You're going to need like a page or 2 document that just says, what's your job? When are you starting? How do you get paid? What other perks and benefits do you get? And you both sign it. The other thing that's most common on there is some signature that they've also received a handbook, which actually is going to go to our question number 2 here in a second. And so that's just a way to think about that first bucket of the way you clarify their role, responsibility, and compensation. In the most simple terms can be like a 1 or 2 page document that you both sign. If you want to make it more complicated, you can have a longer, more legalese driven document that maybe has term limits and things like that. And then the other bucket of things is all the stuff your government wants you to do when you hire a new employee. Anything else we're missing there, Ben?
No, that was pretty comprehensive. I just want to say that feels like a lot. And if
Yeah.
this is something you don't have right now, it is going to feel like a lot getting it all going. But once you have it in place, these are things that like you just check off when you bring somebody on board because your agreement is templated. Your forms that Michael mentioned are ones that you can
Yes.
use again or get the updated one from the government. So it's really just like, here's the 6 things we need them to do when they join, and it's straightforward once you get rolling.
That's it. Yeah, I think there's a very kind of not fun and unsexy to make for the first time. But once you have these things, you never have to really make them again. They just become your standard templates and your standard process. But I think not getting it right actually is pretty dangerous, right? I think not getting it right can get you in some real hot water. So I'd say spend a little time if you haven't on this and just get these systems tight to make sure that you're really abiding by, rules. I think the downside to not hiring someone well is pretty much opening yourself up to some litigation. So if you really want to dial it in, do find, I think Ben, this was a great recommendation, do find that local lawyer or HR professional who can just look over your stuff. Even if you pay them for an hour or 2 of their time just to look over and give you some feedback, that could be a really good use of your funds if you got them. Yeah. All right, let's move on to question number 2. Question number 2 we get is really about when people are onboarding new employees, they ask a little bit about whether or not they need, I mentioned this a second ago, an employee handbook. People are like, I know we recommended it, Business for Unicorns, to all of our unicorn signing members, but people often ask us, is this really necessary? I'm a small team. I got like 2 employees. Do I really need an employee handbook? What would you say to them, Ben?
Yes. or or you at least need like a version of an employee
Yes.
handbook. And correct me if I'm wrong, because you're more in the HR department than I am with your past experiences.
Yeah.
Um, you have a contract that talks about the like, what are we legally agreeing to do together? The
Yes.
handbook is more about like, how do we do those things together?
Yes.
It's got cultural standards. It's got customer service expectations. It might have like response times for standards for your staff so that nothing gets missed. Um, it has dress code. It has hygiene.
Yep.
It has all the hows. So even if you don't want to make like a beautifully formatted PDF and print it out and put it in a binder and keep it up to date, which like I completely understand, you still need to make sure you cover like these are the standards that we're agreeing and how we're choosing to operate together and the values that we're going to embody to believe and continue to agree that this is a good fit.
Yeah, I think that's it, Ben. I think you really nailed the description I would give as well, which is that your offer letter says, okay, well, this is what my job is and how I get paid. Now, if you put yourself in a new employee's shoes, what are all the questions they're going to have next? Those are the questions you want to answer in the employee handbook. Okay, well, how do I get paid? When do I get paid? When does direct deposit work? Do I get days off? How does that work? How many do I get? Do I get reimbursed for anything that I'm spending? What about continuing education, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Any questions you think you might have as a new employee, you really want to try to address in this handbook, in part so you don't have to spend your time repeating yourself over and over again explaining these things, just putting them all in one place. I also say that employee handbook is a legal document. Right. It actually should include some things like some of you might need a non-compete, non-solicitation agreement in your employee handbook. Some of you might need to have a policy for how people interact on social media. Some of you might want an NDA if you have sensitive information you want employees to keep confidential. In the United States, there are some things that we're required to have, like non-discrimination policies, sexual harassment policies, right? So again, I'm listing off a lot of things, and I know this could sound daunting, but truly, if you just Google what should be in an employee handbook in the United States, this is the list of stuff that's going to come out, right? This is the list of stuff, and so the most easy way of thinking about what is an employee handbook is that it answers all of the most basic questions a brand new employee has about how you do things around here and how their employment works. The second bucket of things in there is stuff. Again, this goes back to this. We're answering the same way. Is the legal stuff you have to have in there to make sure that you're abiding the laws of wherever you live. Yeah. Anything you would add to that, Ben?
Um, just my experience is that the handbook and the agreement can have a little bit of blurred lines, like using the examples that you had. And the reason I share this isn't to make it more complicated, is to say that like at mine, we have our non-solicitation in our employment agreement, not in our handbook.
Sure.
It's stuff that an HR professional will be able to help you get clear on, like how exactly does that all fit. But the real point is like you're saying what you're doing, and the handbook is saying like how that all happens.
Yeah, 100%. And these documents can be fluid. In many cases, you want your employees to sign every year and re-acknowledge that they've gotten the new version of the handbook. And what it does is it really kind of protects you to make sure that employees know this is how my employment works. In some cases, it also has things in there, which we're going to get to in our next question. I keep teasing things about our next question. I don't even mean to. It's just happening. But your employee handbook might also talk about like what is your disciplinary process? How will I know if I'm about to be fired? Right? That's really useful to get on the same page about, right? And so the handbook protects you and the employee to make sure you're really on the same page, literally, about how employment functions. And it can change over time. So don't be afraid to change your handbook if things are updated or are outdated or not working for you. Which brings me to our third question, which I was just teasing, but so you might already be guessing what it is. But the third most common question we get is really about the end of employment. It's like, how do you fire someone, right? Which sucks. Let me just start this conversation by saying it's no one's favorite part of the job. I've sadly been part of terminating many people's employments over the years, not just at Mark Fisher Fitness, but my past jobs. And it sucks every time. There's no one's having fun if you have to fire an employee. It's not a good time. And it's also, I think, one of the I think it's top 3 reasons why businesses get sued is for wrongful termination. At least in the US, I don't know stats elsewhere. It might even be the number 1. I'm not sure. I have to look it up. But I think it's because people handle firing so poorly that it makes that employee just your company's worst enemy. And so I think the reason this stuff matters so much is because no one wants to spend any time in court, and no one wants a past employee out there in the world shit talking your gym or you personally. Right? It's not good vibes for anybody, right? And not good for your reputation, not good for your mental health. So if you can avoid it by having real clarity about how people get fired, it is so worth your time, my friends. So Ben, you want to just talk through like what are some big principles here for firing someone well?
Yeah, well, the first one that comes to mind is something you told me, I don't know, at some point, which was hard conversations don't get easier. You just get better at them.
Yeah.
So I think there's something to be said for acknowledging, like, yeah, it's going to be feel kind of awkward and you're not looking forward to it. And yeah, it's going to suck for them, especially. I mean, sometimes you almost wish that it was clear cut that they like stole money from your gym and you'd be like, all
Yes.
right, this is easy. See
So
ya.
easy, right? If everyone just were little thieves, it would be so easy to fire people.
And it's harder when it's someone you've worked with for any period of time and maybe you have a relationship outside the gym with and they got a relationship with other staff or team members and clients. So it's like, heavy things are heavy and it's just leveling with yourself that's okay.
Yeah.
The second piece of that is making sure that you're crystal clear. So like if you're not good with hard conversations, which is completely understandable, we all were terrible at one point, maybe still are, like this is a perfect thing to like document and role play. Like even if it's just in front of the mirror, like what do you want to say? And at least in my experience, sometimes a hard conversation, the waters get muddied because I'm trying not to hurt their feelings. And the nicest thing I could have done has actually been really crystal clear and direct. I'm like, hey,
Mm-hmm.
Michael, this isn't working out anymore. Let's talk about what the end date's going to look like.
Yeah. Yeah. I
And
think
that's a scary thing to say.
Yeah, I think there's such great tips because I think oftentimes we keep employees too long just because we're afraid of this conversation. And I think the more we can prepare ourselves for it, get ready for it, practice it, make notes, it makes these difficult conversations a little bit easier. Never fun, maybe, but a little bit easier. I'll say this: this is probably a longer topic than I think maybe even we'll have time for in this podcast. Maybe at some point we'll do just a more formal one about an actual SOP for terminating someone. But I'll just say this for now, which is the number one most important thing about terminating an employee is that it shouldn't be a surprise to them. Right? Let me just say that again because it's the most important part. No matter what your process looks like, you should not get to this final conversation where someone's being fired and it's a complete and utter surprise to them that this was even a possibility. And the reason that matters so much is because, the research shows that when people are surprised about their termination, they're more likely to sue. They're more likely to retaliate in some way, right? But if you've done a good job of managing them over time and giving them continuous performance feedback and having those difficult conversations and giving them some coaching and correction and helping them improve, maybe finally even putting them on a performance improvement plan if they're not improving. These are all signs to someone that these are all ways that you escalate the conversation. So when you finally might have to let them go, they're like, yeah, I saw this was coming. I know I've been trying to get better. It hasn't worked out, or I keep fucking up, right? That's the best kind of termination conversation where they're not going to be happy. I'm not suggesting that everyone's smiling in this conversation, but it's not a surprise to them. They don't feel like they've been sucker punched, right? Just out of nowhere, just punch in the jaw in the dark, right? That's the last thing we want. So that means so much of what makes a good firing is all the weeks and months of coaching and professional development work you do with them, performance improvement work you do with them before the firing to try to avoid the firing. Of course, Ben mentioned this, that in some cases, you don't get a chance to do all that stuff because something they do just warrants an immediate termination. Right. Someone like, who's had some physical violence or stealing or, I don't know where the line in the sand is for all of you, but hopefully those two things count, right? Someone's physically violent with someone in the gym, they're probably gone, right? They steal something, they're probably gone, right? But sadly, the most common reason people get fired from their jobs is the most boring reason, which is they're just always late. Right. So it's usually sticky. It's like, who wants to fire someone for being late? But yeah. I can tell you, the vast majority of people I've had to fire are because of lateness, including folks at Mark Fisher Fitness. We've had to let go for no other reason. They were great employees. They just couldn't show up on time, which just goes to show that we can do our best to manage that stuff and try and get them to improve. But at some point, you might have to let them go for something really boring and basic, like you can't show up at work on time, which is kind of a bummer.
Yeah. One of my One of my favorite podcasts from BFU is, I think I mentioned this to you before. It's either number 6 or number 8 with Dan Emery, who owns
Mm,
music school, and he talks about how he let somebody go for chronic punctuality issues. So if you're dealing with something like that, go check out that podcast because it's an absolute gem of like, I just think it's a masterclass in how to handle it. But
yeah.
this is also a really good example of like why documenting stuff is so important. That if you've been working with somebody with, it's not just having a conversation like, hey, don't be late again, and then hey, don't be late again, and then the third time they're fired. That's going to feel like a surprise. But hey, Michael, I noticed you weren't on time today. Can we talk about it? Okay, just a friendly reminder that this doesn't have to be perfect, but like we do 2 verbal warnings and then it's a written warning. So if this happens again in the next 6 months, is your second verbal warning. Like you're reminding them that things are escalating.
Yes.
Always, I think the most, or at least in my experience, the place where most gym owners go wrong is that the person is doing stuff that's driving them absolutely nuts, but they haven't given them that specific feedback about it.
Yeah.
So they're like a 10 out of 10 ready to let them go or enraged about it. And the employee is like, yeah, my boss mentioned that to me once, but I think we're cool now.
Yeah.
That's where people are going to have a surprise. So you need to, they need to be on the same page you are in terms of knowing the severity of the things they're doing, or at least the severity of the pattern of behavior that could lead to termination. And like write that shit down. Even if
Yeah.
their file is a Google Doc that they don't have edit access to, that's better than nothing.
Yeah. I think that's really well said. Yeah. I'll say this in the interest of time, 'cause I know we got to wrap things up. When it comes to the actual day of or moment of firing, I think just a few very quick best practices I'll throw out. And Ben, you're welcome to add a few. Is one, it's always best to do it at the end of someone's week or at the end of their shift. So you can just kind of fire them on that day on the spot. I'm not a big fan of, and nor should all of you be a fan of, letting someone know now they're fired in a week. Right. Or you're done after the end of this month. Right. Like that doesn't work. It doesn't work for a lot of reasons that I think should be obvious, but I'll leave it there. If you're going to fire someone, let it be right now. The other thing is, making sure that you're prepared for whether or not they're going to have a final paycheck, need some severance in some cases. You need to turn off passwords and email access and things like that. Need to return some keys, whether or not you're going to have to make a statement to your clients about where they're going. Maybe you'll make a joint statement. These are all things you want to think about before the conversation. So you're ready at the moment of the conversation to kind of do your thing and let them go and be ready for the next steps. And then obviously the moment of the conversation, Ben said this earlier, practice what you're going to say. Be prepared in advance for how you're going to navigate the conversation. Oftentimes there's a letter of termination that goes with this, which again, you should have a template for. And that is a letter that details all the things you say in the conversation. So the reason for termination is very, very clear. Yeah. I'll also say for all of you out there that are Unicorn Society members, we have a firing checklist with templates for all of this. And for those of you who are not Unicorn Society members, if you want access to all this, come join us in Unicorn Society. And we have all this done for you already. So quick little Unicorn Society shout out. But anything you would add to those logistics, Ben?
No, I like the order that you gave those in. One thing that I just kind of want to add, and it sounds very like control-y, but I do think it's important. I don't mean it as big brother as it sounds. Is your staff and your clients and other people are going to come up with all sorts of crazy ass stories about what happened. Even if the person isn't like talking shit, humans are really good at being meaning making machines and adding story to everything. So one of the most valuable things that I've learned is you want to control the narrative on this. And that doesn't mean you're going to throw them under the bus. If anything, I actually advocate for taking the high road, and regardless of the reason they're leaving, celebrate their success and you're excited about whatever their next steps are, even if you're mostly just excited they're not going to steal from you anymore. But you want to let people know pretty quickly and do it in a high road kind of way. So it's not like fire them and then tell your staff 2 weeks later. It's like you might want to send out a message, like that message is written and ready to go, so you can hit send on it 5 minutes after the conversation. The email to clients is written and ready to go. And if all goes well, it can be a joint statement, but make sure that you're dictating the story that's in everybody's mind. And for the small percentage of team and clients that are going to have further questions or a problem with it, you can always address those in one-on-one conversations. It's unlikely 50% of your clients are going to ask you questions if you get the statement out in advance. If you dawdle, you're going to have to deal with a lot of questions, and it's going to be daunting and stressful.
Yeah. Well said, my friend. I think when we can control the narrative here and push that narrative in a positive direction, I think that's really valuable. And even though there's been plenty of people, I'll just speak about MFF for a second, many people who have left under really unfortunate circumstances, who have been fired for really unfortunate reasons, almost 100% of the time, the email that goes out, because it's not no one's business. It's really, frankly, no one's business, including other employees, often why the person got fired. So the story we choose to tell to everyone else is we want to celebrate all the time that Ben has spent here at Business for Unicorns. You're not getting fired, Ben. At Business for Unicorns,
I know that doesn't you.
celebrate all the years and great work he's done. He's going to be moving on to something brand new, and we're here to cheer him on and celebrate and hope good things are in his future, right? Because it's really no one's business what the conversation that happened behind closed doors. In some cases, you might find it appropriate to loop your team in. If the team was involved or impacted by their poor behavior in some way, you might pull back the curtain a little bit for your team. But certainly for clients and your community at large, I think the most you can do to take the high road and tell the most positive version of the story, I think the better.
Agreed.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, let's leave it there. This actually wound up being a long podcast for a topic we thought was maybe not that sexy. I know I have a lot to say about this stuff, so I'm the one that probably made it long. But
Good.
yeah, so dear listeners, we hope that this gave you a little insight into 3 of our most common HR challenges and questions, and hopefully it was a little useful to you. Also, a quick reminder that if you want to join us for our retreats, again, we're going to be in Toronto in March of 2025, talking about marketing and sales for 2 whole days, in Denver in September, talking about people and systems for 2 whole days. So go click the link below in the show notes, which will take you over to Instagram, and then DM us, and we'll send you all the information about our early bird pricing, but you got to do it before Monday, December 16th. So go do it right now. Thanks, Ben. See you on the next one.
Thank you.